Thank you very much, Daniel, for this introduction. So I work for an organization called IPEN. We typically don't use the long name anymore since we work on a lot more than just POPs. But just to explain a little bit more about what we are. We're a global network of civil society organizations. Primarily, our partners are in the global south, so Latin America, Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, or the Central Asian region. And we also have regional hubs around the world that are people that helps us disseminate information in the right language. If you live in West Africa, English is probably not your main language, for example, you want something in French, so that we have hubs that help us to do that. I work as an advisor and a campaign manager at one of our offices. So I'm based here in Gothenburg on Fursta-Långgatan. We also have, we're 3 people here. We have 5 people working in our office in Berkeley. So the staff is not that big. But we also have a range of international experts that are sort of connected to the network, depending on the issue we're working on. So we have about 500 partner organizations in 125 countries. So we are a very big network so my role is to support the network with advice, with coordination, participating in meetings, representing IPEN at UN meetings, for example, things like that. We work on almost anything that has to do with chemicals. And by we, I mean partners in the network. So if several partners say the network needs to focus on this, we do that. So we have toxic recycling, we have perfluorinated chemicals, hazardous chemicals in electronics, what have you. I spend a lot of my time working on lead paint. Primarily, I also work with the Stockholm Convention engagement, so that means persistent organic pollutants. And the thing that unites all our partners is this aim that we have towards a world in which toxic chemicals are no longer produced or used in ways that harm human health or the environment. So that's quite broad. Just a couple of things about the network and the network approach. We have partners. We don't have an IPEN Kenya organization. We have, I think, 10 or something partner organizations in Kenya. So we have established organizations that connect to the network. And that's important for many reasons. It means that they are driven by their needs, by their situation, but also act out of their context. So they know their situation. They know what works, what doesn't work. They know what issues are important. And the benefit with the network is that you have an issue that is important in Kenya. Let's say mercury. That is an issue that is important in many African countries, but also in Asia, in Latin America, actually in the whole world. So that means that you can connect people, but also to disseminate information to people. And also strategies that worked perhaps in one country, or problems that arose in some country, or what have you. So that is sort of the beauty of the network approach, is that we work together. It's very much bottom up, if you want to use that language. So what we do is, as a coordinating structure, as the network, we take these issues that are important to many of our organizations, and we try to elevate them globally. And lead paint is one of them, which I will, of course, get back to. But after there has been some kind of policy decision, the Mercury Convention had a meeting last week, for example. That's also one example where there is a global convention that has been negotiated, and it's very relevant to most of our partners, but then also it has to be implemented locally to have any effect. And that's sort of the circle that we work in, that you bring it up to a global level to get these global agreements, but also it has to be implemented to have an effect. I want to start a little with talking about what are the effects of lead exposure. At least my experience was when I started working on this, I had no idea about lead, because you don't really talk about that in Sweden. It's not an issue. And it's also important when I get into more of the partner countries we work with. It's important to keep that in mind the whole time, that these are effects that are seen in the countries where you have high lead exposure. Sorry. So lead, replaces calcium in the body, and that can mean a lot of things. It can wreak havoc in a lot of ways. And the thing with lead is that it has potential to have an effect even at very low concentrations, and that is harmful. So lead has no benefits for you at any level in your body. It's not supposed to be there. I'm going to focus more on low-level exposure, so you can be lead poisoned and you can die from that and have a lot of really nasty effects. But I'm especially going to talk about low-level exposure to children, because that is something that affects the future of a country. Children are especially vulnerable to lead exposure because it interferes, among other things, with brain development. And there are effects seen from studies at levels as low as 1 microgram per deciliter of blood. So 1 microgram, I don't know how many of you have worked in a lab, but it's a tiny, tiny amount if you're standing there and trying to measure it. It's when you sort of happen to dip the spoon a bit. So these are really low levels of exposure. And since it has an effect on the actual makeup of your brain, it is typically irreversible and untreatable. The only thing you can do is to prevent it. And low-level exposure is linked to a lot of effects that has sort of subtle effects, as Daniel said, lower IQ, but also a lot of behavioral issues like hyperactivity, failure to graduate from school, conduct disorder, and so on and so forth. So it is really subtle, so it's really hard to go back. If you take your kid to the doctor saying we have these issues, the doctor is not going to say, oh, lead exposure, typical lead exposure, because this is so subtle, but they're really important when you start looking at it from a population level. Just a quick view of the sources of lead exposure. Not all of these are relevant in all countries, obviously, but as you can see, you can be exposed to lead in a wide variety of ways. And fortunately, lead in gasoline is out in most countries. I think there are 2 left in the world that hasn't banned lead in gasoline. But you have, in the US, I'm sure you heard about flint and the lead in the water pipes, and so on and so forth. And I will, of course, talk about lead paint. And just to point out that I have put in web links to some of the pictures or illustrations and also some of the data. So they're clickable. So I think this can be shared in the PDF format, where they will still be clickable. So this is a little bit of what Daniel talked about to start with, that if you have a whole population of people that are exposed to lead when they're children, maybe that child doesn't have a lower IQ, but if you look at the normal distribution of intelligence, you will have this bell-shaped curve, and you will see that shifting. You will see the whole population shifting towards a lower IQ. So that means that you will have, on the top IQ range, you will have fewer people there. So fewer leaders, fewer inventors, and so on. And you, at the same time, will have more people that have more challenges, maybe in school, maybe that end up in jail, or whatever. So it's this subtle shift that is so important to think about, that you can actually see population-level effects of lead exposure. And this is obviously not only lead paint, this is for all lead. I'm going to get into the lead paint issues very soon. And I highly recommend the video that this picture is taken from. It's called Little Things Matter. It shows very, very nicely, if I can use that word, on how toxin impacts the developing brain. It's from a scientist called Bruce Lanphier, who's done a lot on lead exposure. And what's also important is that this in turn has an economic effect. So if you were supposed to be very good at something and you suddenly aren't, you maybe can't earn as much as you were supposed to. So that means that, again, on a population level, you can actually see economic impact of lead exposure. Again, this is for all lead sources, but lead paint is one of them. So you can again, there's a web link there. There is research around this where they estimated that there's a huge impact. They've done it for different countries. So for Kenya, for example, annually, about 5% of the GDP the loss of 5% could be due to lead exposure. And think then about the countries where we have partners that have a number of challenges to start with. If you then add to this by also removing some of the gains that they should have had, that sort of adds burden to burden to burden. So I'm going to go through the slides and then we'll have questions because they are filming this. So write down any questions you may have. I'm sure there are more to talk about than I've said and are in the slides. But also a little bit about lead paint. So lead paint is one of the most widespread sources of lead exposure today. We don't see it here because it was banned in Sweden in the 1970s. But I'll also get back to that. It's still highly relevant for a lot of countries. But first of all, why lead paint? First, and you don't add leaded ingredients to any kind of paint. It is the solvent-based paint, so if you open the can, you will smell it. We don't use it that much for home decoration anymore, but if you go to a construction site, for example, you could smell it. It's really this pungent solvent smell. And their lead chromates and other lead compounds work really well as ingredients. They work not so well in contact with children, for example. So what you have is you get paints that are very durable, which is of course important if you live in a country with high humidity, for example. You don't want your paint to peel, 2 months after you put it on. And you also get these shiny, bright colors of yellow, red, orange, so on and so forth, that people like to paint their kids' rooms with, or their schools, or their playgrounds. So it's attractive to children, and it can be used on any surface, more or less. But it's really important to remember that safe alternatives for all these uses are available. There is no need to use lead paint anymore. And it's not only me saying this. This is actually industry. Axel Nobel said it very clearly, for example, to have a Swedish example, or a close to Swedish example. And it's perhaps not obvious how children then get lead exposed. But this is the most common way. So you have lead paint on the wall. It starts to deteriorate a little bit. Happens with any paint, as you've probably seen in your apartment. And then you get lead from the paint into the household dust. Or if it's paint on the outside wall, you get it into the soil. Or if it's on the playground, you will get it into the sand in the playground, or whatever you have there. And kids play around. And they play around and then they put things in their mouth, like their hands. That means that they will swallow lead and be exposed that way. Lead paint is also sweet, so it tastes nice. In the 1920s in the US, they actually marketed lead paint as the nice paint for kids because it tasted so good. So they painted cribs with lead paint because the kids could just, suck on that if they were crying or something like that. So kids could also just peel paint from the wall and sort of eat or take up paint chips from the floor. And you also find it in toys. Our partners in the Philippines, they just released a study where they looked for lead in toys sold on the market. So they found this fidget spinner. That fidget spinner is just a generic one, but a fidget spinner with lead paint on it that had 20% lead. So the strictest legal limit today is 90 parts per million. And that's sort of the solid that is on the wall. So not the solvent, but the dry weight of the paint. 90 parts per million. I see you all thinking, what, parts per million, parts per million? So 200,000 parts per million is 20%. So just think about that difference. Because the paint that has been on that fidget spinner, I'm sure it's been used on other things as well. And it's, of course, a fidget spinner. You use it with your hands. You put it in your mouth if you're a small kid, and you put your hands in your mouth. So this is really terrible. The US is has been using lead paint, I think more than other countries, as far as I know. So, but also, and you can in some ways see us as a really ginormous case study, because they have used lead paint since the 1800s, and they also have a long series of data where they tested children's blood for lead. So you can actually look at lead levels in blood for 100 years or something like that. It was very heavily marketed. This is a brand that's called Dutch Boy. It's one of the infamous ones around in the 1920s. It's still around. They don't do lead paint anymore. But they really marketed lead as the best paint. It's, in hindsight, quite funny, I would say. And you have the same kind of legal struggles as you can see today. I just wanted to put that quote up there because you see the same things happening over and over and over again with different chemicals. It's not the product, it's the user. In this case, and this is also a quote from the 1920s or 30s or something like that, so it's old. But it's not the products. Parents have to make sure that children don't, put their fingers in their mouth, because that's easy if you're a parent to keep constant watch on your kids. Or they should make sure that the kids are not exposed, because it's not the product. It was banned in 1978. But that means that there's a lot of houses still around in the US where they still have lead paint. So they have a huge legacy. And only in California, there was a recent verdict. They actually sued paint companies because they marketed something they knew were toxic. Even it wasn't banned when they marketed it, but the paint companies knew. Everyone, well, most people knows that lead is toxic. And, I think the Romans knew lead was toxic, but still, they marketed lead paint. So there is a bill for 1.15 billion US dollars for cleanup. So that means taking the paint out of these houses and, in a safe way, because of course, removing lead paint is also a problem because you will have this lead dust and so on. I also just want to mention what Daniel touched upon. Lead have such a wide range of effects. There are credible scientific studies looking at this from a number of ways, neurological studies and so on, so that I can actually. It's difficult to plot a graph and say, oh, you see a perfect correlation here. So I first of all just want to say it's more than this. And this is just a summary. There are scientific studies, actually a huge research field in the US. But there are indications that lead paint and lead exposure could be a part of crime rates or a contributing factor to high crime rates. I'm not saying that it's the whole explanation, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And I don't know if you remember, at least I did, the harsh measures they introduced in New York 10, 15 years ago or something, and you could see the crime rate going down, and everyone said, oh, we have to be hard on crime because that is what works. And then you see this, and you think, maybe chemicals could be involved as well, which since I work with chemicals, find fascinating. And there's a lot of information. Again, there's a clickable link there, which I highly recommend. And I put in the Mother Jones link just because it's a summary. It is based on scientific studies. But going back to the global problem, which was what I really work on. So the US banned lead paint in 1978. It was banned in Sweden in 1970 and in Europe. So everyone kind of thought that, hey, we're done with this. And I'm sorry, I put in this most abused quote of the year, I think. At the start of every disaster movie, there's a scientist being ignored. But again, scientists were the first ones who actually sort of tried to raise the alarm. It's like, we see lead paints being sold on the market in India. You know how many people live in India? It's a lot. We see lead paint on the market in Nigeria. You know how many people living in Nigeria? That's a lot. So there's a lot of lead paint still out there, but something has to trigger a reaction. And the reaction in this case was when a big toy manufacturer, Mattel, imported huge number of toys to the US that got caught. I don't think they knew, but those toys had lead paint on them. And that triggered one of our partners in India to do a study of lead paint on the market, because they said, hey, if those toys are painted with lead paint and they're sent to the US, what happens here? And what they saw was that, of course, they had lead paint on the market with levels up to 10-20% of the paint. So 200,000, 300,000 parts per million. Again, compare that to the 90 ppm, which is sort of the recommended highest limit today. And then IPEN, that I work for, did a 10-country study. So we picked, I wasn't around at this time, but the people in charge picked a few countries from every region and looked at the situation, and it was the same everywhere. Lead paint was on the market. So what IPEN did was to bring this issue up to the global policy level. This is obviously an issue that is relevant for all regions, all countries that has not banned it. And that, in different ways, ended up being a policy decision to include lead paint as what is called an emerging policy issue under what's called SICHEM, the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management. Those are details. The main thing here is that it was brought up to the global policy arena, and governments agreed that this was an issue that needed to be dealt with. And that also led to the formation of a global partnership. I'll get back to that because we are a big part of that. That's called the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint. Today, only a third of the countries in the world regulate lead paint, which is, of course, part of the problem. Because what we have seen is that if you don't have a ban on lead paint in your country, then you will have lead paint on the markets. And these countries that are on this postcard, those are the ones that said, yes, we have a regulation. So it says nothing about the enforcement, it says nothing about the strictness or protectiveness. So I know at least one country that has a limit, a safe limit of 10,000 as the maximum permissible limit. Again, compare that to 90, which is recommended today. One thing we do is that we conduct paint studies together with our partners. And that's why we know a lot about what's on the market in different countries today. So this is data from 58 countries. It's available on our website. Again, it's a link there. So you can click on each of those dots and you'll get the data. So and so many percent of the paints that we sampled had, let's say, levels above 10,000 parts per million of lead, and so on. So this is a nice visualization that lead paint is sold in most countries today. Again, I just want to emphasize, I'm not saying that everything that is on the market is lead paint, but lead paint is sold in these countries and most likely used in children's rooms, in schools, on playgrounds. It's also an increasing problem. So it's both an existing problem, but it's likely to increase because there are a lot of countries that are developing financially. Like in Asia, you have a lot of countries that are actually going from developing country into transition country, which is sort of just UN language for different average income definitions. But that means that if you get richer or you get more money, then suddenly you can actually spend money on your house, like painting it, buying a nice paint from the market. So that means that the paint market in Asia is growing something enormous. The forecast that I found in this Coatings journal is for 6% between 2013 and 2018. And that means that if you don't prevent this being all lead paint, or a lot of it lead paint, you have the risk of having a huge legacy in these countries, because I firmly believe the world is moving towards banning lead paint globally. But what will happen on the way? Could we prevent this from being a big issue in Indonesia, for example, in China, in India, whatever country? Just looking at what it would cost to actually take lead paint out of a house. In the US EPA had an estimate that I found on their website that said an average cost for a house, and I'm assuming that's a bigger house than they maybe have in the Philippines, but still $10,000 for one house. Imagine the size of these countries. There's also the issue that there are actually no good ways of disposing of lead paint. Lead is an element, it doesn't break down. People tend to try to want to burn things around the world, so then you get it in the atmosphere if you do it improperly, or they put it into a landfill improperly, so it leaches out into the groundwater. and so on. So prevention is really the key here, and that's also what is our motivation. We need to stop it before it gets too big and too problematic. And that hits me here as to what I'm actually here to talk about, and that's our campaign. But with everything that I already presented, this all feeds into this, because this is important context. So we're a global network. We work both globally and nationally. And our goal is, of course, to ban lead paint in all shapes and forms. We work globally with this global alliance to eliminate lead paint. And that is important because you have the UN Environment Programme, you have WHO. In this case, you have US EPA playing a very positive role. You also have paint industry actors in this alliance that are very supportive of banning lead paint, which is of course important if the industry itself says we're not going to do this. And then IPEN is there representing NGOs. One thing that is important is that this is also a model for how you can work in countries with this issue. And recently, this alliance through the UN, or UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, released its model law on lead paint, which recommends this 90 ppm limit, which is unique for UNEP, and also a very good tool that has come out of this collaboration. What is much more important is the national campaigns that our partners run with the support of the global campaign. So why is lead paint still around? Why don't you just ban it? Well, if you think about Sweden and the legislative process, or any country, it's slow. It takes years because you have to prepare documentation, you have to prepare proof, you have to prepare everything. And then it's a political process. You need to have the political capital to get this through. And in many countries, governments have a lot of priorities. Looking at Africa, for example, government is probably dealing with malaria, with HIV, with global warming, and then chemicals on top of that, and then lead paint. So what do you choose? So that is one reason why it's slow. The responsibility is often the Ministry of Environment, and to be honest, typically has a lower priority than the other ministries, like the Ministry of Finance or something like that. They're sometimes a little bit of the NGOs within the government, so to speak. And there is also a huge lack of awareness of this issue and what a ban would actually mean. There is a myth that it's very expensive to produce paint without lead, which is absolutely non-true. I also want to point out that the same strategies work in these countries when it comes to consumer rights as do in Sweden or any other country. The protection is typically weaker, but people are people everywhere. So, parents want to protect their children, for example. So no one wants to buy a toxic product. And when they find that on the market, that's going to be an issue. And there you have the NGOs, which are flexible actors. They are often very good at capturing opportunities, at working with the right people, collaborating with consumer organizations or with policymakers or what have you. So right now we have partners in around 40 countries that work actively on this issue and engages with various actors. Typically, our groups try to find champions from other sectors. If you have a policymaker, he has typically more say than a civil society organization. And if you can use that person in your meetings, then that's a good thing for your campaign. And I'm going to show a few strategies that we use in most countries that seems to be working well.
But if I can just ask again about the quality of the substitute, because you say that lead paint is with not lead, it's not so expensive. What's the price difference? Why people still prefer the lead paint? Is some property in the paint that is so attractive that they will still prefer it?
It's not consumer driven. This is first of all, people don't know about it. That's the most important thing. A lot of manufacturers don't know what they're putting in. They know what they're putting in their paint, but they don't understand that it's dangerous. And also, if you're producing something and no one complains, you're going to continue doing that. So until something makes you change, you're just going to continue as usual. So those are the three so it's not so much price. When you produce a paint, you have to buy different raw materials, and you have to make different deals with different suppliers to get the right recipe that produces that quality paint. So it's a lot about how good you are at making those deals, and then what color of the paint it is, and so on. So the price is not a big issue really. It is really about making sure that paint manufacturers understand the issue. I will still get back a little bit more to this. So one of the things that is problematic for governments is to act on something they don't know about. So we always start with doing a lead paint study or a paint study or lead content of the paints on the market. So our partners go out, various hardware stores, paint stores, whatever the system is, look at the brands of solvent-based paints that they find for home use, looking at the brands, and then together with us, we make a decision of a representative number of paints, a number of samples. We typically sample a white, a yellow, and a red to look at different components. And then they paint these wood bits that we ship to them because we want to make sure that they are not contaminated at all. So to control that part, we ship those wood bits to them. They paint them, they dry, and then we send them to a separate lab. So we are not doing any lab analysis. We're using an accredited lab in the US that does the analysis, and then we make a report out of that we release to the public, often, not always, naming the brands in that report who sells lead paint. And that is, of course, something people will be interested in. And in those reports, things that we will talk about is, apart from showing these brands sell lead paint, this is why lead paint is a bad thing. A number of brands actually claim that they are lead-free or mercury-free or whatever, which is absolutely false. Not sure if you can see that from the back, but all of these is from Thailand. All of them say no added lead or lead-free, and they all contain levels up to, I have to look myself, 56,000 parts per million down to 43,000 parts per million. So again, compare that to 90, which is the recommended limit. So people are going to be interested in that, and if you couple that to a media campaign, this is a very media-friendly issue. You have kids that are being poisoned. Media will want to write about that. If you have free media in your country, if you don't, you have to use other strategies. So either you go the cute way with kids. Our colleagues in the Philippines did a zombie run. That's what you see in the lower right corner. To talk about brain damage. And various people are very creative. I love this part of our campaigns. I had to pick 3 photos, but I just have, so many with different cute kids in various scenarios showing the issue and who is getting harmed by this. So this is a very publicly attractive issue. We also use this data as hard data to start reaching out to paint manufacturers. And we're not out to meet people and say, you need to change, because that is not really productive in this case. Every issue are different. When it comes to lead paint, since the issue is so often unawareness, our partners will go with their reports, they will meet the manufacturer, they will say, we see that you produce this paint with these lead levels. Let's talk about that. Do you know that? Can we do anything to change? Or maybe they didn't produce lead paint. Oh, you don't produce lead paint. Why is that? Do you want to support the campaign? Do you want to be a spokesperson? And so on. And this support, if you have the industry in your country supportive of an issue, that is a very big win. So what we have noticed is that almost always in all countries, there will be paint manufacturers that really gets this. They may produce lead paint, they may not. It doesn't really matter what kind of paint, it's more about what their feelings are. We have a partner, or a paint manufacturer in the Philippines that are really the global champion nowadays, who got the information and was just shocked and outraged about what they were producing and sort of started this. He made his own industry change, and then he's now a vocal actor in the global community. So he uses this sort of taglines, do you want to be the good or the bad guys? When history looks back on this, who do you want to be? And he thinks it's pretty easy. And this is a big company, so they produced a lot of paint. So it wasn't cheap for them to do this, but for him it was the right thing. It was without a question the right thing to do. Our partners will also reach out to the policymakers, explain the situation, explain what can be done about it. In some countries, they may not, almost all countries have some kind of legal system. Sometimes it's not that developed. Then a model law, as released by UNEP, for example, could be a good tool. You don't have to make up your own. This is going to be really fast. You can just use this model, for example. So to summarize this, because I see time is running out, if you think about the national campaigns, you have to provide motivation for people to act, because if you don't, people won't move. It's like with everything. If you don't give a good reason for doing something, people won't. So if you show the problem with lead paint data, and you have this consistent public awareness activities, that will create consumer behavioral change. And when manufacturers notice that their paints are not getting sold as much, they will change. And then you will have this whole range of stakeholders or people that wants to have lead paint laws. Then there will also be political room or will for the government to act. And it always takes time, but we have seen that in some countries it's going increasingly fast, actually, because it's becoming more and more of a global issue. More and more people are aware of it. But it takes about 3 years from sort of data to a regulation. So it can be done, but it has to take the time it takes. And I want to my final 2 slides are about the civil society role in this, because not all people are aware of civil society organizations or understand why they are important. So I just want to emphasize the role of civil society in all of this, that it is civil society that brings up this issue in 99% of the cases in countries. And what we see is that through our campaign, we get adopted regulations. Very few issues actually can come to that point. Since lead paint is so easy, so to speak, it is a straightforward issue because it has been known for, I don't know how long, how to deal with it. So that also means that you can create change. And changing markets. We have data showing lead paint, or paint studies from 2013, 2015, and 2017 showing less and less and less lead paint on the market in the Philippines. And I had a rumor, this is not verified, but someone told me in the paint industry, told me that leaded raw materials are actually getting more expensive. So that means that people are actually moving away from them. So they sell less, so they raise the prices, which I found encouraging. I also just want to finish with this, that civil society is needed to bring out on this global change as well. Again, civil society brought this up to the global arena, and I'm not talking about our organization, but civil society in general is so important around the world for many reasons, and civil society can create change. So we now see an increased engagement from a number of global actors. The World Bank is getting engaged, UNICEF is getting engaged, and more global actors. And I just wanted to, the final thing I wanted to show was that there is a prize that's called the Global Environmental Prize, the Goldman Environmental Prize, which is sort of the Environmental Nobel Prize. That was won by Manny Calonzo from the Philippines for his efforts around lead paint. So this is really sort of the ultimate sign that this is really getting noticed on a global level. So I think it's time up. Yes. So I'm not going to talk about the EU. I'm going to say thank you.
Well, thank you.